Welcome, friends, to another one of our weekly Ask Prof Wolff sessions. We're really pleased that Democracy at Work has resumed these kinds of presentations. It's a way for you and me to get together and talk and focus our analysis and our conversations on dealing with issues that you care about as well as we do. I want to start today a little bit differently because many of you have asked me to comment on the events in Israel and Gaza, and I want to do so, even though I want to begin by reminding everyone of a famous remark by a journalist. I believe it was an American journalist who said, "The first casualty in every war is the truth." Very, very hard to know what is the truth, to know who to believe, and so on. Having said that, the struggle between Israel and the Palestinians goes back at least to the middle of the previous century. There have been tensions, wars, conflicts, one after another, for many, many years. What that proves is that an agreement, a working out of differences, has not been achieved. The efforts of those who tried were not successful. Honesty requires admitting that. And now we see every day the horrors of having kicked that problem down the road, having made agreements that weren't real, that weren't sustainable, that weren't wanted by one side or the other, or often both. The horror has to stop. I believe the majority of the world will agree in 5 minutes that a ceasefire, an end to killing large numbers of people, wounding many, driving the economies both of the Palestinian area and of Israel down at a time when no one in the world can afford it. All that has to stop. And a ceasefire at least does that. And then there has to be an agreement worked out. I know it will be difficult. I have no illusions. History teaches us that. But that's the best we can do. It is the choice we ought to make. And then the world has to guarantee that an agreement that meets the minimum demands of both sides be what we're after without killing one another in the process. Let me turn then to a couple of questions that you've sent in before I open it up for those of you participating live with us now to ask your questions. The first one comes from Marcus Kasperzik, and my apologies to Marcus if I have not pronounced his name correctly. He asks a wonderful question because it is so important and so classic and has been around for so long. He asks simply, what is the state? Where does it come from? What does it do? And would a proletarian state wither away? Or a kingdom. The state has taken many forms. I'm going to give you the answer that I think makes the most sense, but there are people who disagree with what I'm about to say. There are many different takes on what the state is, which shouldn't surprise us because the state is an important issue, and so people have different ideas about what it means. One idea of the state is that it's an institution developed by people to protect those people who develop it from outsiders, from other communities, other countries, other tribes, other villages. And the state has had that kind of protective function. A second notion is that the state is a way of coordinating activities in a community of many people, where things have to be coordinated and we have to trust whoever the coordinators are, and so we create an institution to whom we give that trust. And then there's the one I would most urgently want you to think about, that the state is a way of maintaining a class structure. If there are powerful differences in a society, particularly the differences that are unequal, for example, a small group of people who are masters and a large number who are slaves, or a small group of people who are lords and a mass of people who are serfs, or a small group of people who are employers and a mass of people who are employees. When you have that kind of class division, then the state takes on another powerful function to keep that going, to make sure that the slaves don't rise up because they're the majority and end the system of slavery, that the serfs don't do it, and that the employees don't do it. So the state has, particularly in modern times, particularly when we've had class-divided societies, the state has taken on the function of imposing the rule of the minority over the majority. In modern times, there's a further wrinkle, that the state works very hard to pretend, to act as if it were what it once was, something that was working for everybody, an institution we all together have and construct. That's why we have suffrage, universal suffrage. The voting is a kind of theater in which we all get together to put together this institution called the state, and we all pretend that it's there for all of us. When this point that I made a minute ago says, no, careful, some of the things it does is for all of us. But some of the things it does is to maintain an unfair, unjust, and unequal class structure. Now, the last part of Marcus's question, will it wither away? Well, that phrase, wither away, is actually most associated with the leader of the Russian Revolution, Lenin. Because Lenin, even though he was an anti-capitalist, a Marxist revolutionary, made a famous remark that when you get rid of the capitalist class structure, that structure with a small group of people at the top called the employer class, and a vast majority of us called the employee class, if you get rid of that, if you replace it with an equality in every workplace, where we're all both workers and employers together, then you don't need a state because there's no minority that is oppressing a majority. And if you don't need the state, well, that kind of state, the one that imposes a class structure, will wither away. And the final point I would make is, when Lenin said that, he was also making a nod in the direction of people who have always put the state at the forefront of what has to be gotten rid of. Those people are called anarchists. Anarchism is the critique of a government that imposes a class structure on people and sustains that unfair, unjust, unequal class structure. There's a basis for an alliance between anarchism and Marxism, between anarchists and socialists, because they want something very similar, the end of the class structure and the end of the state that imposes it. And that would leave the state with merely the protective and coordination functions that it had before class-divided societies became part of human history. Important topic. Thank you, Marcus, for bringing it to our attention. The second question comes from Rashid Gurer, and again, my apologies if I have not pronounced it correctly. Rashid says, if more money was pumped into the economy during the COVID situation to deal with that, wouldn't the solution to the inflation we've suffered ever since be to pull money out of the economy and thereby deal with the inflation. I understand the question. I understand why it occurs to many people. But it is, and this is the only way that I can answer it honestly, it's based on a mistaken premise. Inflation is not because there is more money. Is it possible to have an inflation if you pump a lot of money into the economy? Yes. Those things can happen together, more money and inflation. But because they happen together much of the time, doesn't mean that either of them is the cause of the other. That's the logic you have to keep in mind. And now let me make it very concrete about the United States. In my judgment, as an economist, the inflation of the last 2 to 3 years has been mostly caused by corporations raising prices. Let's be very clear. When we have an inflation, all that means is that prices are going up. That's literally the definition of inflation. Prices are going up. Not all prices, not all the same amount, but an increase in prices. So the first logical question to ask is, well, who controls the prices? Who sets the prices? Because if you answer that question, you'll know who is responsible for the inflation. Now, I'll give you the answer. Employers set prices. Employees don't. Employers in today's United States, for example, are listed as about 2 to 3% of the population. The rest of us are employees or relatives thereof. Okay, so if we have an inflation, it's because employers are raising prices. And do stop for a moment with me and think about that. A tiny minority of the people, 3% of the population are employers, determine the prices that the other 97% of the people have to pay for bread and milk and haircuts and trips and ice cream and anything else. It's a highly undemocratic economic system that would allow unelected minority employers to be in the position of raising prices. And don't be surprised when they do that, what the reason is. We know the reason. It's the same reason employers do anything in the workplace. They're in the business of making money. Profit is what they're in business to get. And one of the ways you get more profits, which every business person knows is the point, is by raising your prices. So we know who's responsible, employers, and we know why they do it, to make more money. But here's a problem, and this explains the question. The employers don't want to be blamed by the employees for raising prices. So whenever they do it, they always tell us a story about why it wasn't them. It was something else that made it happen. It was the union that fought for higher wages, or it was supply chain disruptions, or, as in your question, it was the government printing money. Nice try, Jack, but it won't work. And I'll give you the simplest explanation. If it were the government printing money, let's remember what that means. Let's suppose the government literally pumped a lot of money into the economy. Here's what we know. Every businessman, woman would know that the economy is now being filled up with money. The Federal Reserve is printing it. The government is creating it. Now every business has a decision to make. How do you respond if you're a storekeeper or a factory owner or an office manager? How do you respond to there being more money in the economy? The answer is you always have a choice. You can respond by raising prices. But let's remember, then you have an inflation. But the reason you have an inflation is because that's how businesses responded Did they have to? Not at all. Here's the alternative way a business could respond if there's more money in the economy. Order more stuff to sell to people. They've got more money because the government is pumping it in. You can order more things and get that money, which is what you're after, by selling more apples or ice cream cones or haircuts. So it's always the employer's choice which will determine whether or not we have an inflation. Wow. Last part of the question that we have time for. Are there better ways than raising interest rates to deal with it? Yeah. Very quickly, in order to give time for other questions. We can deal with inflations in many ways. I'm going to give you examples of what's not done today that used to be done in American history not so long ago, when we had inflations to deal with. I'll start with the most famous, most recent. President Richard Nixon. It's August 15th, 1971. We have a bad inflation, worse than the one we've had in the last 2 to 3 years. And what does the conservative Republican President Nixon do? He declares a wage price freeze. He goes on the radio and television and says to the American economy, any business person who raises a price of anything will be arrested and put in jail. That's how we stop an inflation. Any union that pushes for higher wages, same thing. Guess what? Inflation stopped on a dime. I didn't make this story up, and I'm not describing anything that happened in a foreign country. Richard Nixon, conservative Republican president, did that, and we stopped an inflation. I'll give you a second example. It's the middle part of the 1940s. The United States is at war, World War II. And to be at war meant that all kinds of resources were not going to be used to produce consumer goods. They are being used instead to produce guns and tanks and planes for the war, which means the output of consumer goods would go down suddenly. Meanwhile, the American people wanted to buy food, clothing, shelter, the way they always did. Demand hadn't gone down, just supply. If you allow the free market to work, it would mean the prices of everything would have gone sky high. Rich people would have come in knowing that there wasn't enough for everybody because we were fighting a war, and they would have bid up the price because they can afford it. And the mass of Americans who weren't rich couldn't afford it. They couldn't get. And so we would see little scenes like this. A family with many children can't get milk. It's too expensive. Rich people bid up the price of milk so they could feed it to their pet kittens. Uh-oh. And the advisors to President Roosevelt said, you'll divide the country between rich and poor, and that will undermine the war effort. So guess what? We didn't have an inflation because we said we're not using the free market anymore. The government printed ration tickets, and the only way to buy milk or gasoline or meat or sugar or many other things was with the tickets the government gave you. And you know how the government gave them to you? Each according to their needs were given tickets. The needy got in a way they never would have if the market had worked, because markets are the best way for rich people and the worst way for the poor. All right, let me turn now to all of you and say, if you have a question and you haven't already, send it in. We don't have time for many, but it is a way for us to learn through your questions, and not only those we answer, but those we get and we look at, how to craft programs like this one for the future, as well as the other things we do, the economic update, our weekly radio and TV show, and so on. So here's the first question from Lucio. Can large organizations like Amazon or the Postal Service convert to a worker self-directed enterprise? In other words, a worker co-op, without much pushback? Well, I'd like to answer that question by dividing it into two parts. Can it convert into a worker co-op? The answer is clearly yes. Can it do so without much pushback? There the answer, unfortunately, is for sure no. Let me explain briefly. Amazon and the Postal Service are, of course, very large organizations. They have hundreds of thousands of employees. They're scattered over the United States in the case of the Postal Service, or the whole world in the case of Amazon. So they're very large. So part of the question's background really is this: can large working organizations, productive organizations, be handled without a hierarchy, without a president and a bureaucracy and a mass of employees? And I want to answer that question very clearly. Yes. That question, by the way, has been asked about all kinds of organizations of working people. It was asked about slave plantations. It was asked about feudal manors. It was asked about ancient villages. You know why? Because it's a good question. Can the institutions that often start small become big? Or will there be too many problems for a big enterprise to be able to work? Let me remind those of you who may not know that capitalism had that problem. Capitalism, the relationship of employer to employee, started with small capitalist enterprises. An entrepreneur with 3 or 4 employees, maybe members of his or her family. And then they grew. And over time, as they grew, these enterprises, if they were successful and could grow, they reached certain size where they had to ask this question: can we grow? What we need to do to grow is to get a whole bunch of machines, for example. But we don't have the money to buy those machines. And if we don't have the money, we can't buy them. And if we can't buy them, we can't grow. So we just can't. Oh no, someone came along. There is a way. And that way invented something we nowadays take for granted: the stock market. All kinds of people who had nothing to do with your enterprise could chip in and buy a share of your enterprise, giving you the money for the share you're giving them. And with the money you got from the share purchasers, you could buy the machines and you could grow. And we developed the modern corporation. In the early centuries of capitalism, there were no such corporations. There were no stock markets, etc. Well, exactly the same thing has happened to worker co-ops. Those that are successful grow. And at a certain point, they have to decide, is there a way for us to continue to grow? I can answer the question. Amazon and the post office can certainly do the same. Here's the example. The most famous and successful worker co-op in the world today is a corporation. It's actually a family under one corporate organization of about 200 co-ops, worker co-ops, in which all of these co-ops, here's how they work. The workers together decide democratically, one worker, one vote, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits they all help to produce. They all started as little co-ops, and then they found a way to get together and be one big co-op. The name of it, Mondragon. Also the name of the city where this was all taking place, in the northern part of Spain. It started as a group of 6, count them, 6 workers in a Catholic parish led by a priest who said at a time of great poverty in Spain, if we wait for an employer to come here and provide jobs, we will all die of old age before that happens. So together with his 6 parishioners, the Catholic priest started a co-op. Now fast forward to today. That co-op has over 100,000 members. It's a family, as I said, of 200 co-ops, more or less. It's the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It is extraordinarily successful. It includes factories, farms, offices, stores, the whole business. It's proof, concrete proof, that big institutions with huge numbers of employees can become worker co-ops, can become institutions described by the letters WSDE, worker self-directed enterprises. There are no divisions between employers and employees in them. The organization of the enterprise is democratic. One person, one vote. Not a few people at the top who are effectively dictators inside the corporation, the way most CEOs are. It's radically different, and yeah, it is possible. But will it happen without a pushback? I can't imagine it. I think Amazon's worst nightmare is what I've just described. The people who own Amazon, the people who run Amazon are not willing, able, even to think about sharing their power and their wealth with everybody democratically. So yeah, they're going to push back. They're going to try to use the government, to go back to Marx's question, to help them prevent the very transition that for the mass of people might be not the nightmare, but the dream. Here's another question from you today. Armin, he asks, how can labor organize as artificial intelligence inevitably starts displacing jobs and replacing the working class? Well, we hear a great deal about artificial intelligence, but I want to ask you to join with me in remembering, excuse me, that it is only the latest in a long history of technical changes. You know, when we learned as a human race to replace the effort of a horse or an oxen and use instead a plow, and use instead a plow run by a machine, a motor, there would be millions of farmers who became unemployed. And we all saw it, and we all understood it. And artificial intelligence is only the latest one, and everybody's worried, as well they should be, that this new technology will displace people from jobs, will give the job to a computer instead of a husband, a wife, a cousin, an uncle, a sister. These are reasonable fears, but I want to stress they were never the necessary outcome. Let me give it the explanation by a little parable, a little story, very simple, but it makes the point. Imagine a piece of artificial intelligence, a software program, who knows what form it takes, it doesn't matter, to tell this story. And let's suppose that if we bring that artificial intelligence into a workplace, a factory, an office, a store, it makes the workers twice as productive as they were before. The same worker can do twice as much work, have twice as much output as he or she did before if they use this artificial intelligence. We know what the capitalist employer will do when such technology becomes available. The capitalist employer will say, I am now going to fire half of my workers. I'm going to fire them because I don't need them anymore. I have this piece of equipment, and I only need half the workers that I used to have. With this equipment, can produce just as much as before was produced with twice as many workers. And why will the capitalists do it? because the capitalist gets to keep the wages of the half of the workers he used to have that he doesn't have to pay anymore. For him, this is a bonanza. This is wonderful. I lay off my workers, half of them, and that money I used to pay them in wages, I keep. It's extra for me beyond everything else I'm doing. The profitable way to implant artificial intelligence will be at the cost of workers' jobs. But now here's the important lesson. That's not the only thing that could have been done. Here's another way an employer could have reacted to artificial intelligence. The employer could have said, wow, every worker is twice as productive as he, she, they were before. And so here's what I'll do. I'm going to cut the work week from 5 days to 2.5. Or maybe I'll cut the working day from 8 hours to 4 hours. And you know why? Because in 4 hours, the workers can do as much output as it used to take 8 hours because they now have the piece of artificial intelligence. I'll pay the workers the same as I always did, but they'll only have to work half the time. I'll still have the same amount of output to sell, and I'll have the same amount of revenue and the same amount of profits as I did before. I will not have more profits. But look what I will have done. I will have given my workers the benefit of the new technology, the artificial intelligence. And how will I have given it to them? In the form of giving them 4 hours a day less work to do with no cut in pay. That's what the technology makes possible. And you know, the world has always known it. The argument in favor of every new technology was it'll make work less. We'll have more free time. We'll have more time for the relationships we would like to have with friends, neighbors, families, lovers, etc. That was always the justification, and yet people were always puzzled. The promise of new technology was never realized. Or to be more accurate, the promise of new technology was realized the way the capitalists wanted it, more and more profits, not the way the workers wanted, more and more leisure. But that's not the fault of the technology. The technology could have gone either way. It could have given workers a whole new life with half the day given back to them. Or it could have made the wealthy employer class even wealthier. Well, under capitalism, it was used for the latter, the second thing. It's made the profits go crazy. It's made the rich get richer, and it hasn't done much for the mass of the people. Please be aware that an honest society, not even a socialist one, although for sure a socialist one would be more likely to at least ask the question, can we use the new technology to improve profits for capitalists? Answer it honestly. Yes, we can. Alternative, can we use the new technology to enhance the free time of working people? And there the answer is yes, honestly, we can, which means how technology is used should be put up to a democratic vote. Had that been done, our working days today would be 1 or 2 hours long. We wouldn't have those super rich people, but we'd have a different and better life for the vast majority. The problem is not the technology. The problem is a system that uses technology in a very lopsided and undemocratic way. We do have time for one more before we cut it out. Well, maybe not. I guess I have to look at the clock. We've reached the end of today's session. I hope you are all enjoying this as much as I am enjoying doing it. Your questions teach me, and I hope my responses are teaching you as well along the lines of the questions and the issues you've raised. We're perfecting this new program of Ask Prof Wolff. Thank you for your patience developing this program with us. And I want to remind you all that I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Bye-bye.